The sirens began at 11:47. Across Tokyo's northeastern wards, the wail cut through the cold March night, pulling families from sleep, sending them stumbling toward shelters they knew would not be enough. Above the city at 25,000 feet, something had changed. The Pathfinder B-29s descended through the darkness, their silver fuselages catching moonlight as they dropped below the clouds. 5,000 feet, lower than any American bomber had dared to fly over the Japanese mainland. At 12:15, the first magnesium clusters tumbled from open bomb bays, igniting into brilliant crosses of white fire across Asakusa Ward. The markers burned at 3,000 degrees, visible for 50 miles. They formed a geometric pattern, a flaming X that would guide 334 superfortresses carrying 7 tons of incendiaries each. In the streets below, air raid wardens stared upward, recognizing the shapes but not understanding the tactical shift. The Americans had always bombed from high altitude, their payloads scattered, their accuracy poor. Not tonight. Tonight, General Curtis LeMay had stripped the guns from his bombers and sent them in low. Tonight, 1,600 tons of jellied gasoline would fall on a city built of wood and paper. The firestorm would begin in 23 minutes. By March 1945, the Pacific War had entered its 4th year, and the strategic calculus had shifted entirely in America's favor. The island-hopping campaign had delivered Saipan, Tinian, and Guam into American hands by summer 1944, transforming the Mariana Islands into forward air bases within striking range of the Japanese homeland. For the first time, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber ever built, could reach Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya with enough fuel to return. The Japanese Empire, once spanning from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands, had contracted into a defensive perimeter centered on the home islands. American submarines had strangled maritime supply lines. Surface fleets had been shattered at Leyte Gulf. But Japan's military leadership showed no inclination toward surrender. The strategic bombing campaign that followed those island seizures had been, by any objective measure, a disappointment. Beginning in November 1944, WWII Bomber Command launched high-altitude precision raids against Japanese aircraft factories, steel mills, and engine plants. The doctrine came directly from the European theater, where B-17s and B-24s had pounded German industrial centers from 25,000 feet. But Japan was not Germany. Weather patterns over the home islands proved wildly unpredictable. Jet stream winds at altitude sometimes exceeded 200 miles per hour, scattering bomb patterns across miles of countryside. Cloud cover persisted for weeks. The Norden bomb site, so effective over the clear skies of occupied Europe, became nearly useless over Japan. Worse still, Japanese war production had never centralized in the manner American planners assumed. Intelligence photographs showed factories, yes, but the reality was far more dispersed. Thousands of small workshops and cottage industries produced aircraft components, ammunition, and military supplies in residential neighborhoods. A ball-bearing facility might occupy 3 rooms of an apartment building. Fuselage assembly could happen in converted schoolhouses. This decentralized network made precision bombing not just difficult, but strategically questionable. A formation of B-29s might destroy a designated factory, only to learn that its actual output had been negligible, its components sourced from dozens of invisible workshops scattered across the city. The B-29 itself added complications. Designed for high-altitude operations, the Superfortress burned enormous quantities of fuel, reaching its operational ceiling. Engine reliability plagued early models. Overheating, fires, and failures occurred with alarming frequency. Crews nursed damaged aircraft across 1,500 miles of open ocean, praying the engines held. Combat losses to Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire remained tolerable, but mechanical failures killed more airmen than enemy action. By January 1945, after 2 months of precision raids, WWII Bomber Command had expended thousands of tons of ordnance with minimal strategic impact. Japanese war production continued. Civilian morale remained intact. The raids were costly, dangerous, and ineffective. Into this frustration stepped Major General Curtis Emerson LeMay, transferred from the European theater in January 1945 to assume command of WWII Bomber Command. LeMay's reputation preceded him. Ruthless, calculating, willing to experiment with tactics his peers considered reckless. In Europe, he had developed formation techniques that reduced bomber losses while increasing accuracy. He studied statistics obsessively, measured outcomes without sentiment, and adjusted doctrine based on results rather than theory. His assessment of the Japan campaign took less than 2 weeks. Precision bombing was failing because the targets were wrong and the altitude was wrong. LeMay recognized what intelligence analysts had been documenting for months. Japanese cities were fundamentally vulnerable to incendiary attack. Construction patterns dating back centuries favored wood and paper. Urban density in Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya exceeded anything in Europe. Fire lanes barely existed. Water pressure in residential areas proved inadequate for firefighting. A British analysis from earlier in the war had concluded that incendiary raids could produce catastrophic urban firestorms. But American doctrine had resisted the approach, preferring the precision targeting philosophy. LeMay had no such ideological attachment. He saw the statistics, average B-29 accuracy from high altitude measured in miles, not feet, and concluded that precision was a fantasy. If Japanese war production hid in residential districts, then residential districts would burn. The decision carried immense risks, professional and tactical. Low-altitude bombing exposed aircraft to every anti-aircraft gun in the Japanese arsenal. Fighters could intercept more easily. The B-29's defensive armament, 1250 caliber machine guns operated by a sophisticated central fire control system, had been designed specifically for high-altitude protection. Stripping those guns to increase bomb load seemed suicidal to veteran crews. But LeMay's analysis suggested otherwise. Japanese night fighter capabilities remained primitive compared to German defenses. Anti-aircraft fire, while intense, proved less accurate than expected. And the weight savings from removing guns and gunners allowed each B-29 to carry an additional 3 tons of incendiaries, the weapon that would transform American. Strategic bombing doctrine arrived in standardized clusters. The E-46 500-pound incendiary bomb, each containing 47 M69 submunitions. Chemical engineers at the Army's Chemical Warfare Service facility in Maryland had designed the M69 specifically for Japanese construction. The bomblet weighed 6 pounds and measured 3 inches in diameter by 20 inches long. Inside jellied gasoline, early napalm surrounded a white phosphorus igniter. Upon impact, a fabric streamer deployed to ensure nose-first orientation, driving a firing pin into the igniter. The napalm then sprayed outward in a burst of flame that adhered to wood, paper, and fabric, burning at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Water couldn't extinguish it. Smothering proved nearly impossible. It burned through roofs, ignited tatami mats, and created secondary fires faster than any fire brigade could respond. Test results from Dugway Proving Ground in Utah had been conclusive. Engineers there constructed replicas of Japanese residential blocks using authentic materials: timber frames, paper screens, tile roofing. Incendiary tests in late 1944 demonstrated that M69 clusters could ignite structures with terrifying efficiency. A single E-46 cluster, properly distributed, could start fires across a 40-yard radius. Dropped in concentration, the bomblets created overlapping ignition zones that overwhelmed firefighting capacity within minutes. Wind conditions amplified the effect. Tokyo's prevailing northwestern winds in March averaged 15 miles per hour, strong enough to carry embers across fire breaks and spread flames into adjacent neighborhoods. American intelligence on Tokyo's fire defenses painted a grim picture for the city's civilian population. The Japanese government had organized neighborhood fire brigades composed of volunteers, mostly older men, women, and teenagers, as military conscription had claimed younger males. Equipment consisted of hand pumps, bucket brigades, and rudimentary chemical extinguishers. Fire breaks existed in central districts created by demolishing entire blocks of homes, but coverage remained sporadic. The city's water infrastructure, designed for peacetime residential use, lacked the pressure and volume necessary for large-scale firefighting. Fire departments possessed motorized equipment, but fuel shortages limited mobility. Training emphasized containing small fires through immediate response, a doctrine utterly inadequate for coordinated incendiary attack. Weather analysis for early March indicated optimal conditions. Seasonal winds remained consistent and predictable. Cloud cover had been minimal throughout February, and forecasts suggested clear skies would persist. Moon phase calculations showed sufficient illumination for visual navigation, Without providing enough light for effective Japanese fighter interception, LeMay's operations staff selected the night of March 9, 10, based on meteorological data, aircraft availability, and crew rest schedules. The target zone encompassed the densest residential and light industrial sectors of Tokyo, the wards of Asakusa, Honjo, Fukagawa, and parts of Nihonbashi. Population density in these districts exceeded 200,000 per square mile, among the highest concentrations of humanity anywhere on Earth. The operational plan represented a complete departure from previous doctrine. Pathfinder aircraft would strike first, dropping M47 napalm bombs to create visual aiming points. These 100-pound napalm canisters burned with intense magnesium-white flames, forming geometric patterns visible from high altitude. Main force bombers would follow at staggered intervals, approaching from different vectors to saturate air defenses. Each aircraft would carry between 6 and 8 tons of E-46 clusters, depending on fuel load and distance flown. Bombing altitude, 5,000 to 7,000 feet, low enough for accurate visual drops but high enough to avoid small arms fire. Defensive armament removed except for tail guns. Crew complement, reduced from 11 to 9 men, with gunners reassigned to other duties. LeMay briefed his wing commanders on March 8th, presenting the plan with characteristic bluntness. Losses, he estimated, might reach 5%, roughly 17 aircraft. But the strategic payoff justified the risk. A successful incendiary raid could destroy Japan's dispersed war production more effectively than months of precision bombing. It would demonstrate American capability to strike anywhere, anytime, with overwhelming force. And it would, LeMay believed, hasten the war's end by making clear to Japanese leadership that continued resistance meant the systematic destruction of every major city. At air bases across Guam, Tinian, and Saipan, ground crews loaded E-46 clusters into bomb bays throughout the afternoon and evening of March 9th. Armorers stacked the clusters nose to tail, maximizing capacity. Fuel trucks topped off tanks for the round trip, roughly 3,000 miles including combat time over target. Pilots attended final briefings, studying reconnaissance photographs of Tokyo, memorizing landmarks and approach vectors. Navigators plotted courses that would bring the bomber stream over the target in coordinated waves, saturating defenses before Japanese controllers could organize effective response. Radio operators tested encrypted communication systems, and in the enlisted barracks, gunners who would not be flying tried to reconcile relief at being grounded with guilt at not protecting their crews. The first engines turned over at 10:37 that evening. Angle 1. The Air Crews. Perspective inside the B-29 nicknamed Tailwind, Flight Engineer Technical Sergeant Robert Raymer sat at his station and tried not to think about the empty gun positions behind him. The aircraft felt wrong without the familiar weight of the dorsal and ventral turrets, without the additional crewmen whose voices usually filled the intercom during missions. Command had ordered the guns stripped, all except the tail turret and the gunners reassigned. The official explanation made sense on paper. Extra bomb load, reduced weight, greater fuel efficiency. But at 5,000 feet over a city bristling with anti-aircraft batteries, paper logic felt inadequate. Raymer had flown 17 missions over Japan from high altitude. At 25,000 feet, the cold bit through heated suits and oxygen masks fogged with each breath. But the distance provided psychological insulation. Flak bursts appeared as distant black puffs. Fighters became tiny silhouettes, often visible only when they dove through the formation. Combat felt abstract, almost cinematic. Tonight would be different. At 5,000 feet, they would see faces in windows. Street fires would illuminate the bomb bay. Every machine gun on the ground could reach them. The removal of defensive armament transformed the B-29 from a flying fortress into a cargo hauler, betting survival on speed and darkness rather than firepower. Other crews expressed the same quiet anxiety during pre-flight checks. Pilots who prided themselves on stoic professionalism admitted to navigators' uncertainty. Bombardiers accustomed to the Norden bomb site's complex calculations would instead drop visually, releasing incendiaries when Pathfinder flames filled their view. The mission stripped away familiar procedures and replaced them with calculated gambles. Yet beneath the fear ran a current of pragmatic acceptance. High-altitude precision raids had accomplished little. Crews returned from missions reporting perfect bomb runs only to see reconnaissance photos showing their ordnance scattered across empty fields. If this new approach, crude, brutal, undeniably effective, could end the war faster, most airmen would accept the risk. Angle 2. LeMay's tactical gamble. Curtis LeMay understood that his career balanced on the outcome of this single night. At 38, he held a Major General's stars and commanded the most technologically advanced bombing force in history, but his predecessors had been relieved for failing to produce results. The Washington brass wanted measurable progress, destroyed factories, collapsed production, evidence that the billions spent on B-29 development justified the investment. LeMay's radical tactical shift bypassed established doctrine, contradicted Air Force orthodoxy, and risked catastrophic losses if Japanese defenses proved more capable than intelligence suggested. The decision to remove defensive armament troubled him less than it troubled his crews. LeMay studied loss statistics obsessively and recognized that high-altitude missions lost aircraft to mechanical failure and navigation errors more often than enemy action. Japanese fighters struggled at 25,000 feet. At 5,000 feet in darkness, their effectiveness would diminish further. Anti-aircraft fire remained the primary threat, but concentrated bomber streams would saturate defenses, forcing Japanese gunners to divide attention across multiple targets. The mathematics supported the gamble. Higher bomb loads and lower altitude would multiply destructive capacity by a factor of 3, while losses might increase only marginally. But LeMay also recognized the moral dimension his critics would inevitably raise. Incendiary raids on residential districts crossed boundaries that precision bombing doctrine had carefully maintained, at least in theory. The distinction between military and civilian targets would blur, perhaps vanish entirely. American propaganda emphasized the righteousness of the Allied cause, the barbarism of Axis powers who bombed civilians in Shanghai, Rotterdam, London, and Covington. Now American bombers would deliberately ignite cities where women, children, and elderly civilians far outnumbered military personnel or industrial workers. LeMay rationalized the approach through the lens of total war. Japanese home production supported the military. Civilian morale sustained resistance. Ending the war quickly would ultimately save lives on both sides. Whether history would accept that rationalization remained uncertain. Angle 3. Japanese civil defense reality. In Tokyo's Fukagawa ward, Neighborhood Association leader Yamamoto Kenji conducted his nightly inspection of firefighting equipment with grim awareness of its inadequacy. 2 hand-pumped water carts, 16 buckets, 8 shovels, 4 ladders, and 20 cotton blankets soaked in water. This comprised the firefighting capability for 3 city blocks housing approximately 4,000 residents. Municipal fire departments existed, but their capacity had been stretched beyond effectiveness. Fuel shortages limited motorized response. Personnel had been reduced through military conscription. Water pressure in residential mains barely sufficed for peacetime needs. The government had ordered the creation of fire breaks throughout Tokyo, demolishing entire neighborhoods to create gaps that fires could not cross. Families displaced by these demolitions moved in with relatives or occupied increasingly crowded public shelters. The fire breaks themselves varied wildly in effectiveness. Some stretched 200 feet wide, others barely 50. Enforcement proved inconsistent. In densely populated wards where every square meter held economic value, property owners resisted demolition until authorities arrived with official orders and sometimes police escort. Civil defense training emphasized immediate response to incendiary bombs. Official instructions directed residents to smother small fires with wet blankets, suffocate ignition sources with sand, and form bucket brigades to prevent flame spread. The doctrine assumed scattered bombing, isolated ignitions, and time for organized response. No training addressed coordinated mass incendiary attack. No procedures existed for evacuating entire districts simultaneously. Shelters, mostly reinforced basements or shallow trenches covered with earth, offered protection from blast and fragmentation, but became death traps in fires that consumed entire blocks. Air raid drills occurred regularly, but they rehearsed responses to conventional high-explosive raids, not incendiary firestorms. Yamamoto had lived through the April 1942 Doolittle raid, when 16 American B-25s struck Tokyo in daylight. That attack killed fewer than 100 people, and caused minimal damage, but it shattered the government's assurance that the home islands were invulnerable. Since then, air raid alerts had become routine, often multiple times per week as American reconnaissance aircraft overflew the city. Most alerts resulted in no bombing. Residents grew complacent, sometimes ignoring sirens entirely. But those who studied the pattern recognized an escalation, more frequent raids, heavier damage, and an apparent shift in American targeting doctrine toward less precision and more saturation. Angle 4. The technology. The E-46 cluster bomb represented a convergence of chemical engineering, aerodynamic design, and industrial psychology. Each 500-pound canister contained 47 M69 bomblets arranged in a hexagonal pattern, held together by a thin metal casing designed to rupture at preset altitude. A barometric fuse triggered the separation at approximately 2,000 feet, dispersing the submunitions across an area roughly 50 yards in diameter. The pattern ensured overlapping ignition zones. Each M69 could start fires across a 10-yard radius, creating a carpet of flame that no firefighting team could contain. The M69 itself embodied lessons learned from earlier incendiary designs. British raids on German cities had demonstrated that thermite bombs, while intensely hot, burned too quickly and in too concentrated an area. Magnesium bombs produced spectacular flames but often burned through roofs and into cellars, where they ignited nothing. The jellied gasoline formula in the M69 solved both problems. Upon impact, the bomblet's fabric streamer deployed, orienting the nose downward and driving a firing pin into a white phosphorus igniter. The phosphorus flash vaporized a small explosive charge that ruptured the casing and sprayed napalm outward in a fan pattern. The gel adhered to surfaces, burned at sustained temperatures between 900 and 1100 degrees, and resisted water-based extinguishing methods. Chemical warfare. Service engineers had tested dozens of formulations before settling on the final napalm composition, a mixture of gasoline thickened with aluminum naphthenate and aluminum palmitate. The gel's viscosity prevented rapid burning while ensuring thorough surface coverage. Ignited napalm could flow through cracks, seep under doors, and spread flames into enclosed spaces. It produced thick, toxic smoke that disoriented firefighters and civilians alike, and it generated heat sufficient to ignite secondary targets: wooden support beams, paper partitions, fabric furnishings, creating self-sustaining fires that continued burning long after the initial napalm had been consumed. Delivery accuracy at low altitude transformed the weapon's effectiveness. High-altitude drops scattered E-46 clusters across square miles, diluting their impact. At 5,000 feet, bombardiers could visually aim for specific districts, dropping entire bomb loads within concentrated target zones. A single B-29 carrying 40 E-46 clusters delivered 1,880 individual M69 bomblets, enough incendiary capacity to ignite every structure across a 10-block area. 334 bombers, each carrying similar loads, would drop over 600,000 individual fire-starting bomblets in less than 3 hours. No city on Earth possessed the firefighting infrastructure to respond to simultaneous ignitions on that scale. Angle 5. Tokyo's geography. Tokyo, as vulnerability stemmed directly from centuries of urban development patterns that prioritized density over safety. The city's flatland geography, situated on the Kanto Plain adjacent to Tokyo Bay, facilitated horizontal expansion but encouraged construction practices that maximized limited space. Buildings stood wall to wall with minimal separation. Narrow alleys barely wide enough for 2 people to pass served as primary circulation routes in residential wards. Fire lanes existed in commercial districts but disappeared entirely in neighborhoods where property boundaries had evolved organically over generations. The northeastern ward selected for attack, Asakusa, Honjo Fukagawa, represented the oldest and densest sections of Tokyo. These districts had grown without formal planning, their streets following paths established in the Edo period 3 centuries earlier. Construction remained predominantly traditional: wooden frames, tile or thatch roofs, paper shoji screens, and tatami mat floors. Even structures built in the 20th century adhered to these materials out of cultural preference, economic necessity, and seismic considerations. Wood frames flexed during earthquakes where masonry crumbled. The Sumida River bisected the target area, creating a natural landmark for bomber navigation but also a fatal trap for civilians. The river's width varied from 100 to 300 yards, its banks lined with warehouses, docks, and small manufacturing facilities. Bridges crossed at regular intervals, but their capacity proved insufficient for mass evacuation. Canals branched from the main river, threading through residential blocks as part of the historic water transportation network. These waterways would become death zones during the firestorm, as civilians seeking refuge from flames died from scalding water temperatures or drowned in the crush of panicked crowds. Wind patterns in March amplified Tokyo's vulnerability. Northwestern winds prevailed during late winter, averaging 12 to 15 miles per hour with gusts occasionally exceeding 25. These winds channeled through the city's east-west streets, pushing flames forward faster than people could flee. The relatively flat topography offered no high-ground refuge. Parks and open spaces existed but in insufficient quantity. City planners had prioritized efficient land use over public commons. The few large open areas like Ueno Park sat outside the primary target zone, too distant for residents in the attack corridor to reach once fires began spreading. Population density in the target wards exceeded any American city. Fukagawa Ward alone housed over 300,000 residents in approximately 4 square miles, 75,000 people per square mile. Families occupied structures of 800 to 1,200 square feet, often in multi-generational arrangements. Many ground floor spaces doubled as workshops where residents manufactured military components, assembled munitions, or produced supplies for the armed forces. This pattern of integrated residential industrial development made the distinction between military and civilian targets effectively meaningless. Every block contained both. Angle 6, the moral calculus. The decision to conduct mass incendiary raids on Japanese cities forced American military and political leadership to confront questions they had largely avoided in the European theater. Precision bombing doctrine, while never perfectly executed, at least maintained the pretense of discriminate targeting. Aircraft factories, rail yards, oil refineries. The incendiary campaign abandoned that pretense. LeMay and his superiors understood that burning residential districts would kill tens of thousands of civilians, perhaps hundreds of thousands. The justification rested on several arguments, some more defensible than others. First, the integration of war production into residential areas meant that truly discriminate targeting was impossible. Intelligence photographs showed small workshops scattered throughout Tokyo's densest wards, producing everything from aircraft parts to ammunition. Destroying this dispersed industrial network required destroying the neighborhoods that housed it. Second, Japanese military doctrine relied on civilian participation, fire brigades, civil defense units, home guard formations. The entire population, by this reasoning, contributed to the war effort and therefore constituted a legitimate military target. Third, and perhaps most cynically, American strategists believed that mass civilian casualties would break Japanese morale and force surrender, obviating the need for a ground invasion that would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. Critics within the military and government recognized these arguments as expedient rather than ethical. The distinction between combatants and non-combatants enshrined in international law and military tradition was being erased. The precedent set over Japan could be used to justify virtually any attack on any city. Some dissenting voices argued that such tactics would harden Japanese resistance rather than break it, rallying the population around the government in shared victimhood. Others worried about post-war accountability. Would Allied leaders face the same judgment they intended to impose on Axis war criminals? Yet these moral objections carried little weight against the crushing momentum of total war. By March 1945, the conflict had consumed 4 years, cost hundreds of thousands of American lives, and demanded unconditional enemy surrender. Japanese forces had demonstrated willingness to fight to annihilation. On Saipan, civilians had committed mass suicide rather than surrender. At Iwo Jima, Marines faced near-universal resistance to the death. The invasion of mainland Japan, planned for autumn 1945, projected casualties in the millions. Against this calculus, incendiary raids that might shorten the war by weeks or months seemed not just acceptable but necessary. The bombs would fall, The cities would burn, and the moral reckoning, if it came at all, would come later. The Pathfinder B-29s crossed the Japanese coastline at 11:58. Their approach masked by darkness and the low rumble of engines that Tokyo's air defense network had learned to recognize too late. By the time sirens began their wailing across the city's northeastern wards, the lead aircraft had already begun their runs. At 12:15 on the morning of March 10, 1945, Captain James Patton released the first M47 napalm markers from 7,000 feet. The canisters tumbled through cold air, armed themselves in freefall, and ignited upon impact in perfect geometric patterns across Asakusa Ward. White-hot magnesium flames erupted in the shape of a massive X, each arm stretching 200 yards, burning at temperatures that made them visible from 70 miles away. Japanese observers on the ground understood immediately that something had changed. Previous American raids had approached from high altitude, their bombs falling with the characteristic whistle of high-explosive ordnance. These aircraft flew lower, their engine noise deeper and more immediate. And the markers, those brilliant white crosses of flame, indicated a level of coordination that suggested massed attack rather than scattered harassment. Air raid wardens blew whistles, shouted warnings, directed residents toward shelters. But the prescribed response, practiced in hundreds of drills, assumed time for organized evacuation. Tonight there would be no time. The main bomber stream arrived at 12:28. 334 B-29 superfortresses approached Tokyo from multiple vectors, some from the south over Tokyo Bay, others from the west across the Kanto Plain, still more from the northeast following the coastline. The staggered approach overwhelmed Japanese air defense coordination. Anti-aircraft batteries fired blindly into darkness, their searchlights sweeping across the sky but finding targets only intermittently. Night fighters scrambled from airfields around the city, but the sheer number of inbound bombers scattered their effectiveness. A Ki-45 fighter might intercept one B-29, even score hits, but a dozen more would pass untouched while the fighter climbed for another intercept. At 5,000 feet, bombardiers had visual clarity unimaginable at high altitude. They could see the Pathfinder flames, the street patterns, even individual buildings illuminated by fires beginning to spread from the initial markers. Bomb bay doors opened with mechanical precision, E-46 clusters released in rapid succession, tumbling downward in streams of dark cylinders that caught moonlight for an instant before disappearing into shadow. At 2,000 feet, barometric fuses triggered. Metal casings ruptured. 47 M69 bomblets per cluster dispersed, across the sky like deadly seeds scattered by an invisible hand. The impact pattern created a sound unlike anything Tokyo's residents had experienced, not the explosive crash of high-explosive bombs, but a cascading rush of smaller detonations, hundreds per second overlapping into a continuous roar. M69 bomblets punched through tile roofs, through wooden walls, through paper screens. White phosphorus igniters flashed. Jellied gasoline sprayed outward in fan patterns. Flames erupted simultaneously across dozens of city blocks. A single B-29's bomb load could ignite every structure within a 10-block radius. 334 aircraft, dropping their loads across a concentrated target zone, created ignitions faster than human cognition could process. In Honjo Ward, schoolteacher Masuda Yuki had sheltered her students in the basement of their school building when the sirens began. The structure was concrete, built in the 1930s, ostensibly fire-resistant, but the roof was traditional tile and wood. When incendiaries punched through, napalm poured down stairwells, ignited wooden desks and paper supplies, and filled corridors with smoke before Masuda could organize evacuation. She led 43 children toward the exit, feeling heat intensify with each step, hearing the roar of flames consuming the upper floors. They emerged onto a street already engulfed. Buildings on both sides burned. Embers filled the air like demonic snow. The choice became immediately clear: stay and suffocate or run toward the Sumida River 6 blocks east. Across the target zone, thousands made the same calculation. The Sumida became a destination, a hope, the only promise of survival as fires merged into a single advancing wall. But the river was already filling with people. Families clutching children, elderly couples supporting each other, individuals stripped of everything but the instinct to flee. Bridges became choke points where crowds compressed, panicked, trampled the fallen. Some jumped directly into the water, swimming toward the opposite bank or simply floating away from the flames. Others stood at the river's edge, hesitating, until the heat made the decision for them. The firestorm began its transformation from coordinated attack into self-sustaining phenomenon around 1:15 in the morning. Individual fires, ignited by M69 bomblets, merged into block-sized conflagrations. These in turn combined into district-wide infernos that generated their own weather. Superheated air rose rapidly, creating powerful updrafts. Cooler air rushed in from surrounding areas to fill the vacuum, creating ground-level winds that exceeded 40 miles per hour. These winds pushed flames forward, carried embers across fire breaks, and fed oxygen to fires that might otherwise have starved. The system became self-reinforcing. More fire created stronger winds, which accelerated fire spread, which intensified the convection cycle. B-29 crews at altitude felt the turbulence from heat rising off the burning city. Aircraft struck invisible walls of superheated air, dropping suddenly, shuddering as thermal currents buffeted their wings. Some pilots reported updrafts powerful enough to lift their aircraft 1,000 feet in seconds. The smell reached cockpits through oxygen masks, burning wood, scorched metal, and underneath it something organic and terrible that pilots refused to identify but couldn't ignore. Below Tokyo burned with light bright enough to read by at 7,000 feet. The pathfinder markers, so brilliant at first drop, had become unnecessary. The city itself had become a beacon, its destruction lighting the way for each successive wave of bombers. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the firestorm had achieved total dominance over human response. Tokyo's municipal fire departments had collapsed as a functional entity. Telephone lines burned, water mains ruptured from heat, fire trucks abandoned in the streets melted, their tires igniting, their fuel tanks exploding. Fire brigades that attempted to fight the flames found themselves surrounded within minutes, cut off from escape routes that had existed moments before. Some firefighters died at their posts, manning pumps until the equipment failed or they suffocated. Others fled with the civilians they had been trying to protect. Recognizing the futility of resistance against fires that consumed entire blocks in less than 10 minutes, the bombing runs continued in carefully orchestrated waves. Each B-29 carried between 12 and 16 E-46 clusters, plus supplementary M-47 markers and occasional high-explosive demolition bombs intended to crater streets and hinder firefighting access. Bombardiers released their loads across altitude bands from 5,000 to 7,000 feet, adjusting based on smoke density and thermal turbulence. The lowest flying aircraft experienced the most violent conditions. Pilots wrestled with controls as updrafts and downdrafts struck without warning. Navigators struggled to maintain heading as wind shear pushed the aircraft off course. But the low altitude enabled precision that transformed strategic bombing into tactical demolition. Bombardiers could select specific city blocks, aim for intersections where fires would spread most effectively, and observe their impacts in real time. Individual bomb statistics revealed the scale of destruction unfolding below. A single B-29 carrying 14 E-46 clusters delivered 658 M69 bomblets, each capable of igniting a 10-yard radius. Dropped in concentration, this represented enough incendiary capacity to set fire to every structure across roughly 15 city blocks. Multiplied across 334 aircraft, the mathematics became almost incomprehensible. Over 220,000 individual fire-starting bomblets falling on approximately 12 square miles of the most densely populated urban terrain on Earth. Even accounting for duds, near misses, and bomblets that struck already burning structures, the saturation exceeded anything in the history of aerial warfare. On the ground, those who had reached the Sumida River discovered that water offered no sanctuary. The temperature of the air above the river climbed to unbearable levels as fires on both banks converged. People standing in chest-deep water felt their hair singe, their skin blister from radiant heat. The water itself grew warm, then hot, then scalding in places where burning debris fell from bridges or where flaming structures collapsed directly into the current. Some drowned intentionally, submerging themselves to escape the heat only to discover they could not hold their breath long enough for the fires to pass. Others clung to bridge pilings, concrete embankments, anything that might shield them from the radiant inferno, their fingers cramping, their strength failing. The Azuma Bridge, spanning the Sumida in the heart of the target zone, became a monument to the night's horror. Thousands converged on the structure simultaneously, fleeing fires from both approaches. The crowd compressed until movement became impossible. Those in the center suffocated from pressure and heat. Those at the edges were pushed over railings into the river below. The steel structure itself conducted heat until its surface became untouchable. Bodies accumulated in layers. The fallen trampled by those still moving. The dead and dying compressed into grotesque density. By dawn, authorities would count over 800 corpses on the bridge alone, though exact numbers would never be confirmed. Japanese night fighter response, initially scattered and ineffective, achieved sporadic successes as the raid progressed. Lieutenant Shirai Tadao, flying a Ki-61 fighter from Chofu Airfield, managed 3 intercepts during the 2-hour attack window. His first attack damaged a B-29's No. 3 engine, forcing the aircraft to drop altitude and jettison remaining ordnance over Tokyo Bay. His second pass resulted in a deflection shot that wounded the American tail gunner, but caused no critical damage. His third intercept, executed at dangerously low altitude while pursuing a bomber silhouetted against the flames below, ended when ground fire from Japanese anti-aircraft batteries, unable to distinguish friend from foe in the chaos, struck his aircraft. Shirai bailed out over Chiba Prefecture, surviving the night but losing his fighter. Anti-aircraft fire throughout the raid remained heavy but poorly coordinated. Gun crews tracked aircraft by sound more than sight, their searchlights overwhelmed by the glow from burning districts. Shells burst in the general vicinity of bomber formations but achieved few direct hits. American losses from ground fire totaled 9 aircraft confirmed destroyed, with another dozen sustaining damage, sufficient to require emergency landings at Iwo Jima or ditching at sea. The 5% loss rate LeMay had predicted proved remarkably accurate. 14 B-29s failed to return to base, representing roughly 4% of the attacking force. Against the scale of destruction inflicted, the losses seemed almost trivial, a bargain struck in metal and men for objectives achieved beyond initial projections. The last bombers departed Tokyo airspace at 2:47 in the morning. Behind them, 16 square miles of the city burned in a firestorm that would rage for another 6 hours. The updrafts remained so powerful that charred paper and fabric debris rose thousands of feet, some pieces carried by high-altitude winds far out over the Pacific. Reconnaissance aircraft launched at first light photographed a city transformed, where dense residential wards had stood at midnight. Now only ash and isolated stone foundations remained. The Pathfinder markers still burning in places seemed absurd against the vastness of destruction they had initiated. Tokyo's northeastern districts had been erased, their population scattered, killed, or trapped in pockets of survival amid the devastation. Dawn revealed the truest measure of the night. The sun rose over a landscape of ash and smoke, where isolated fires still burned and no structure remained intact. Across the entire target zone, the reconnaissance, aircraft that overflew Tokyo, at dawn on March 10th transmitted photographs that silenced briefing rooms across the Marianas. Intelligence officers who had analyzed hundreds of bombing raid results found themselves staring at images that defied their assessment frameworks. 16 square miles of urban landscape had been transformed into a monochrome wasteland. Ash, charred rubble, and the skeletal remains of concrete structures that had survived only because they contained nothing combustible. The Sumida River cut through the devastation like a dark ribbon, its banks littered with debris and bodies. Smoke columns rose from fires still burning in isolated pockets, their heat signatures visible on infrared film. The Pathfinder markers, those brilliant X patterns that had initiated the attack, were no longer discernible. The destruction they had guided now covered everything. Casualty estimates began arriving within hours, though accurate counts would remain impossible for weeks. Tokyo Metropolitan Police initially reported approximately 80,000 dead, but this figure excluded bodies burned beyond recognition, those drowned in canals and rivers, and entire families vaporized in the firestorm's core. By March 15th, official counts exceeded 95,000 confirmed deaths. Final assessments compiled months later settled on approximately 100,000 killed in a single night, more than either atomic bomb would claim individually, more than the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, and more than any single bombing raid in human history. An additional 40,000 suffered severe burns, smoke inhalation injuries, or trauma requiring hospitalization. Over 1 million residents were rendered homeless, their possessions reduced to ash, their neighborhoods erased. The physical destruction statistics painted an equally stark picture. Fire damage assessments documented 267,000 buildings destroyed: homes, shops, workshops, temples, schools, and factories. The boundary between military and civilian targets had become meaningless in practice, as fires consumed everything regardless of its strategic value. Aircraft component workshops burned alongside family residences. Military storage facilities ignited next to elementary schools. The dispersed industrial network that had frustrated precision bombing was now simply gone, along with the residential fabric that had concealed it. Insurance companies, already overwhelmed by previous raid damage, stopped processing claims from the affected wards entirely. The concept of rebuilding seemed absurd when entire districts had been reduced to ash. General Curtis LeMay received the initial damage assessments with satisfaction tempered by strategic caution. The raid had achieved its objectives: massive destruction of industrial capacity, severe civilian casualties intended to break morale, and demonstration of American capability to systematically destroy Japanese cities. But LeMay recognized that one successful raid did not constitute a campaign. Japanese leadership might interpret the attack as an aberration, a lucky strike under ideal conditions. The strategic impact would only materialize if the March 9-10 raid became the first of many. If Japanese cities faced the credible threat of systematic incineration, until surrender became the only rational choice. Within 48 hours, LeMay ordered follow-up raids against Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. The operational template remained consistent: low-altitude night attacks, maximum incendiary loads, stripped defensive armament, and concentration on densely populated urban districts. Nagoya burned on March 11, suffering 14 square miles of destruction and approximately 3,000 deaths. Osaka followed on March 13th with 9 square miles consumed and 4,000 killed. Kobe burned on March 16th, losing 3 square miles and 2,400 residents. The casualty figures for these cities appeared modest compared to Tokyo, but they reflected more effective civil defense response, less optimal weather conditions, and smaller target areas rather than any fundamental change in American tactics. Japanese media coverage of the raids evolved rapidly from defiant nationalism to barely concealed desperation. Initial reports described the Tokyo attack as a heinous terror bombing perpetrated by an enemy bereft of military targets and reduced to attacking defenseless civilians. Radio broadcasts emphasized the barbarity of American methods, the bravery of Japanese firefighters and civil defense personnel, and the resilience of the population. But as follow-up raids struck additional cities with mechanical regularity, the propaganda shifted toward preparing civilians for continued hardship. Newspapers published survival guides for firebombing, how to recognize incendiary bomblets, proper evacuation routes, locations of designated shelters. The subtext was unmistakable. More attacks were coming and no city was safe. International reaction varied by source and political affiliation.
Allied media celebrated the raids as evidence of
overwhelming American air power and justified retaliation for Japanese atrocities throughout Asia. Newspaper editorials in the United States emphasized that Japanese cities produced war materials and housed the workforce sustaining enemy military operations, framing civilian casualties as unfortunate but inevitable. British commentary drew parallels to German firebombing of London and Covington, suggesting that Japan was now experiencing the consequences its Axis partnership had initiated. Soviet coverage remained muted. Stalin's government had no strategic bombing capability comparable to the American or British forces, and had focused its aerial operations on tactical support rather than strategic city destruction. Neutral observers and international humanitarian organizations expressed more conflicted responses. The International Red Cross issued carefully worded statements expressing concern about the humanitarian impact of incendiary raids while acknowledging the complexities of total war. Swiss newspapers published casualty estimates and survivor testimonies that painted stark pictures of civilian suffering. Vatican officials, already troubled by the strategic bombing campaigns in Europe, privately urged restraint while publicly maintaining diplomatic neutrality. But these voices carried little weight in March 1945. The war's momentum had long since overwhelmed humanitarian considerations. Victory, unconditional and absolute, justified methods that peacetime morality would have condemned. Within the Japanese government and military command, the firebombing campaigns triggered debates that had been simmering since the fall of Saipan, but now became urgent. Emperor Hirohito received daily briefings on raid damage, casualty figures, and the deteriorating capacity of Japanese cities to absorb continued punishment. His private communications, documented in palace records and later testimony, revealed profound concern about the sustainability of continued resistance. The emperor understood that American strategic bombing had entered a new phase, one that threatened not individual military targets, but the entire social and economic foundation of Japanese civilization. Yet advocating surrender remained politically impossible, while military leadership insisted that one decisive battle could still turn the war's momentum. The Supreme War Council convened emergency sessions throughout mid-March to assess strategic options. Hardline military officers, particularly within the Army General Staff, argued that the bombings demonstrated American desperation, that the United States lacked the will to invade mainland Japan and was resorting to terror tactics in hopes of breaking civilian morale. These officers pointed to continued Japanese resistance despite overwhelming material disadvantage, suggesting that American public opinion would not tolerate the casualties a ground invasion would require. Their conclusion: endure the bombings, maintain military readiness, and wait for American resolve to falter. Moderates within the government, primarily civilian ministers and naval officers, recognized this assessment as delusional. Japan's economic capacity was collapsing. Shipping losses had reduced imports to starvation levels. Industrial production fell week by week as factories burned and workers fled to rural areas. The American submarine blockade had proven devastatingly effective even before the firebombing campaign began. Now, with major cities facing systematic destruction, the possibility of organized national defense seemed increasingly fantastical. But these moderates lacked the political leverage to force surrender negotiations against military opposition. Japanese political culture and the constitutional role of the military gave army officers effective veto power over strategic decisions. Air defense improvements, desperately needed, proved impossible to implement at scale. Japan's aircraft production capacity, already strained by material shortages and bombing damage, could not replace fighter losses at rates sufficient to contest American air superiority. Pilot training programs had collapsed, fuel shortages limited flight hours, experienced instructors had been killed in combat, and the accelerated curriculum produced aviators who lacked the skill to effectively engage B-29s. Anti-aircraft gun production continued, but ammunition shortages limited their deployment. Radar installations, never abundant, were destroyed faster than they could be replaced. By late March, Japanese air defense had become largely symbolic, enough to inflict occasional losses on American formations, but incapable of preventing raids or even significantly disrupting them. The psychological impact on Japanese civilians manifested in ways both predictable and surprising. Mass evacuations drained Tokyo, Osaka, and other major cities as residents fled to rural areas, often leaving behind elderly relatives unable to travel. Schools closed as teachers and students departed. Factories struggled to maintain operations with dwindling workforces. Yet morale, while clearly deteriorating, did not collapse in the manner American strategists had predicted. Japanese cultural emphasis on endurance, loyalty to community, and collective sacrifice proved more resilient than bombing advocates had assumed. Survivors organized spontaneously to clear rubble, distribute food, and care for wounded. Neighborhood associations maintained order without police presence. The social fabric frayed but did not disintegrate. This resilience created a strategic paradox that troubled American commanders. The firebombing campaigns were achieving their physical objectives. Cities burned, industries collapsed, transportation networks severed. But the psychological objective, breaking civilian will to resist, remained elusive. Intelligence reports noted declining morale but no evidence of organized anti-war sentiment, no mass movements demanding surrender. If anything, some survivors expressed intensified determination to resist, viewing American tactics as barbaric and confirming propaganda claims about enemy savagery. LeMay and his superiors recognized that bombing alone might not force capitulation. that invasion might still prove necessary. Despite months of systematic destruction, the key acceleration toward ultimate confrontation gained momentum through April and May as American forces captured Okinawa in brutal fighting that left 75,000 Japanese military personnel dead and tens of thousands of civilians killed in crossfire or mass suicides. The battle demonstrated what invasion of the home islands would entail: fanatical resistance, massive casualties on both sides, and the near-total destruction of whatever territory became contested. American casualty projections for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Kyushu and Honshu, ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million. These estimates assumed continued Japanese resistance at Okinawa intensity levels, resistance that no amount of strategic bombing seemed likely to break. Yet the firebombing campaigns continued with mechanical efficiency through spring and into summer. Target lists expanded to include medium and small cities, populations of 100,000 or less, as LeMay's planners worked methodically down the roster of urban areas. Yokohama burned on May 29th, losing 7 square miles and 8,000 residents. Osaka burned again on June 1st, losing another 6 square miles. Kobe, already struck once, burned again on June 5th. The raids became routine, expected, almost mundane in their regularity. Japanese civil defense stopped evacuating cities entirely. There were simply too many targets and too few safe destinations. Civilians remained in place, prepared shelters as best they could, and accepted that survival had become primarily a matter of fortune. By early August 1945, when atomic weapons entered the equation, 67 Japanese cities had been subjected to major firebombing raids. The strategic bombing campaign had killed between 300,000 and 500,000 civilians, rendered millions homeless, and destroyed approximately 40% of urban Japan's total built environment. The question of whether this devastation hastened surrender remained contested. Japanese leaders who advocated capitulation cited multiple factors: Soviet entry into the war, atomic bombings, continued conventional raids, naval blockade, and the impossibility of victory. The firebombing campaigns formed one element of an overwhelming cumulative pressure that made continued resistance untenable. The precedent established over Tokyo that March night would echo through military doctrine for decades to come, the night of March 9 to 10, 1945, stands as a threshold moment in the history of warfare, the point at which strategic bombing transcended its theoretical boundaries and became an instrument of near-total urban destruction. What Curtis LeMay initiated over Tokyo was not simply an escalation of existing doctrine, but a fundamental redefinition of what air power could accomplish and what costs it could impose. The firestorm that consumed 16 square miles of the world's most densely populated city in 3 hours demonstrated that modern military technology had achieved the capacity to erase entire urban populations with methodical efficiency. The atomic bombs that would fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki 5 months later shocked the world with their revolutionary destructive power. Yet they killed fewer people than the incendiary raid on Tokyo. The difference lay not in the death toll but in the mechanism: instant annihilation versus sustained incineration. The moral questions raised that night have never been satisfactorily resolved. Advocates of strategic bombing argue that the campaign shortened the war, saved lives by obviating ground invasion, and responded proportionally to Axis atrocities throughout the conflict. Critics contend that targeting civilian populations, regardless of military justification, violated the fundamental principles of warfare that distinguish soldiers from non-combatants. The truth, uncomfortable and complex, likely inhabits the space between these positions. Total war, by its nature, erodes boundaries. When entire national economies mobilize for conflict, when home workshops produce military supplies, when civilian morale directly impacts military capability, the distinction between military and civilian targets becomes tactical rather than absolute. What remains inarguable is the human cost. 100,000 people died in Tokyo that night. Individuals with names, families, ambitions, and futures that ended in flames or suffocation or drowning. Their deaths achieved strategic objectives that military planners believed necessary for victory. Whether those objectives justified the methods used to achieve them is a question each generation must answer for itself. knowing that the capacity to inflict such destruction has only expanded since 1945. The firebombing of Tokyo revealed both the awesome power of modern warfare and the terrible responsibility that accompanies it, a lesson burned into history as indelibly as the scars left on the Japanese landscape that March night.